Chapter 21. "George, you are absolutely right," Eric said as they waved goodbye to all the scientists, who were leaving now that the conference had come to an end. George and Eric went back into the library, which was covered in cake crumbs, half-drunk cups of coffee, old pens, and conference papers folded into airplane shapes. "We need to work on saving this planet and looking for a new one. We don't have to do one or the other." "Do you think you will?" asked George. "You and your friends? Do both, I mean." "Oh, I think so, yes," said Eric. "Maybe we could invite your parents to our next conference. Do you know, George, I heard your father's talk at the climate change protest march the other day. Maybe he has some good ideas we could use." "Oh, no, don't do that," said George, panicking. He wasn't at all sure that his father would approve of Eric and his friendly scientist. "I don't think he'd like that." "He might surprise you," said Eric. "We all need to work together to save the planet if we're going to get anything done." We started to clear up some of the mess the scientists had made. They seemed to have left behind an extraordinary number of things: jackets, hats, sweaters, even a shoe. "It was very nice of you to drop by to apologize," said Eric, gathering together a great armful of abandoned clothing. "Well, actually," admitted George, "that's not quite why I came around." Eric dumped the clothes in a corner of the room and turned back to look at him. "I signed up for a science competition," the boy continued nervously. "It's sort of like your conference, except it's kids giving the talks, and there's a big computer as first prize. I've tried to write something to say, but I'm really worried I've made lots of mistakes and everyone will laugh at me." "Yes, Annie told me about your competition," said Eric, looking serious, "and I've got something that might help you. Funnily enough, I had an idea after your comet ride. I decided to start writing a book about the universe for you and Annie. I've made some notes. They might help you with your science presentation." He picked up a plate of cookies. "Have one of these. Brain food." George helped himself to what was left of the cookies. "How about this for an idea?" said Eric thoughtfully. "If you could just give me a hand to get my library straightened up a bit. Annie's left me strict instructions that I'm not to make the house messy while she's away. Then we can talk about your science presentation and I'll go through the notes I made for you. Does that sound like a fair deal?" "Oh, yes," said George, delighted by Eric's promise. "What would you like me to do?" "Oh, perhaps a little sweeping or something like that," said Eric vaguely. He leaned casually on a wobbly pile of chairs as he spoke, accidentally pushing them over with a loud crash. George burst out laughing. "You can see why I need help," said Eric apologetically, but his eyes were twinkling with laughter. "I'll pick up these chairs, and maybe you could brush a bit of this mud off the floor. Would you mind?" The carpet was covered in footprints left by the scientists, none of whom ever remembered to wipe their feet on the doormat. "Not at all," said George, stuffing the last cookie into his mouth and running off to the kitchen, where he found a dustpan and brush. He came back into the library and started to swish away at some of the worst bits of dirt. As he looked, a piece of paper stuck to his brush. He picked it off the bristles and was about to throw it away when he realized it was a letter addressed to Eric. There was something strangely familiar about the handwriting. "Look at this!" He passed the note to Eric. "Someone must have dropped it." Eric took the piece of paper and unfolded it while George kept on sweeping. Suddenly he heard a great shout. "Eureka!" cried Eric. George looked up. Eric was just standing there, piece of paper in hand, a joyous look on his face. "What's going on?" George asked him. "I've just been given the most amazing piece of information," cried Eric. "If this is correct—" He peered at the piece of paper again, holding it up very close to his thick glasses. He muttered a long string of numbers to himself. "What is it?" asked George. "Hang on." Eric seemed to be calculating something in his head. He ticked off a series of points on his fingers, scrunched up his face, and scratched his head. "Yes," he said, "yes." He stuffed the paper into his pocket, then picked George up off his feet and whirled him around. "George, I've got the answer. I think I know." Suddenly dropping him again, Eric went over to Cosmos and started typing. "What do you know?" said George, who was a little dizzy. "Great shooting stars! This is fantastic!" Eric was frantically tapping on the computer's keyboard. A huge flash of light shot out of Cosmos' screen into the middle of the room, and George saw that the great computer was once more making a doorway. "Where are you going?" George asked. Eric was struggling into a spacesuit, but he was in such a hurry that he put both feet into one pant leg and fell over. George hauled him up again and helped him on with the suit. "So exciting," said Eric as he buckled it up. "What is it?" said George, who was now feeling rather alarmed. "The letter, George, the letter. This might be it. This might be what we've all been looking for." "Who was the letter from?" asked George, who had a bad feeling in his stomach, although he didn't know why. "I'm not sure," admitted Eric. "It doesn't really say." "Then you shouldn't trust it," said George. "Don't be silly, George," said Eric. "I expect it was written by someone at the conference who wanted me to check out the information using Cosmos. I expect they wanted to know it was correct before they announced it to the whole scientific community." "Then why didn't they just ask you directly? Why write a letter?" persisted George. Because, said Eric, sounding a little annoyed. "They probably had a good reason, which I'll find out when I get back from my trip." George saw that Cosmos' screen was now covered in long strings of numbers. "What are those?" he asked. "Those are the coordinates of my new journey," said Eric. "Are you going now?" asked George sadly. "What about my science presentation?" Eric stopped in his tracks. "Oh, George, I am sorry," he exclaimed, "but I really have to go. It's too important to wait. Your talk will be fine without me. You'll see. But—" "No buts, George," said Eric, putting on his glass space helmet and speaking in his funny space voice once more. "Thank you so much for finding that letter. It has given me a vital clue. Now I must go. Good-bye." Eric leaped through the portal doorway and was gone into outer space before George had time to say another word. The portal slammed shut behind him, and George was left alone in the library.